So I suggest that we therefore make a start, because my introduction is, my colleague said, that's going to take you longer than 20 minutes to do the introduction, and they know me very well, so they're probably quite right. So this is the plan for today. First of all, a welcome, and I have some slides of introduction. By way of introduction, we weren't too sure how many of you were familiar with the book Supporting Strategy and its prior research. It has a long pedigree. So I volunteered to give a little bit of an introduction, which in theory will take 20 minutes, but who knows. We then plan to essentially split us off into 3 or 4 breakout groups where we get a chance then to introduce ourselves, or rather you'll get a chance to introduce yourself to those of the colleagues in the room with you, as well as your area of expertise. And you can come clean as to whether or not you know anything about the book and whether you'd be interested to contribute to another version of the book, and if so, how. Now, we've allowed a really good long time for that, about an hour. At the moment, I can see we've approximately 30 people. So maybe 3 breakout groups. I'm looking at Martin to nod or shake his head, nod. 3 breakout groups. Given that Robert has got issues with his connection, I suggest that Karen, the 3 that chair the breakout groups, is Giles, Martin and myself, with Robert joining a group and helping out.
I'll just join the group.
Yeah, brilliant. So we've got an hour for those breakout groups. We'll then possibly have a short break of 5 minutes or so, just a comfort break, because 2 hours in one stretch is quite a long time. Then we'll reconvene and get each of the groups to share their feedback and talk about what we do next, what the plan is. So that is the plan for today. Anything else before I kick off? I'm looking at Martin. Nope. He's the only one I can see at this stage. Okay, so a very warm welcome. Who are we? We are Robert Dyson, who is now Emeritus Professor of OR from Warwick Business School. Myself, I'm an Associate Professor of OR, also at Warwick Business School. Martin used to be at Warwick Business School, but is now Professor of Business Analytics and Management Science at Southampton Business School. And Giles, who also was here a long time ago, is now Senior Lecturer at Hull University Business School. So welcome to the 4 of us. A little bit of backstory. I think it was at OR 63, Giles was leading a session, and there were some comments in the chat about whether or not there should be a new edition of the book. And both Robert and I were at that session, and we both agreed that there should be. So we had a chat afterwards, and we persuaded Martin and Giles to join us in editing and thinking about a new edition of the book. So that's why the 4 of us have got together and invited you all to join us in reflecting on the book and the strategy process that's associated with it, and to think about where we might take a new version of the book. Now, the book, as I said, has a history. So let me explain that history to you. So its origins are in empirical research that was undertaken back in the 1970s and 1980s by Robert and a colleague from Warwick, John Foster. And they produced a number of papers that were published in both OR and strategy journals at the time. And then in 1990, the first version, I don't want to call it an edition because they're more like versions of the book, was published by Robert. And so I came across this just as I started my academic career at Warwick in 1990. And this was largely a collection of previously published papers that Robert brought together on the topic of supporting strategy. Then in 1998, I joined the team, and we produced a mixed volume, which was a combination of previously published work, but also bespoke chapters that were written for the book. And then the most latest incarnation, which by now is quite old, in 2008, was a completely bespoke set of chapters written for that volume. Now, the common thread that ties all of these three together is this notion of a strategic development process. And what you can see here are the two earlier incarnations of that strategic development process. So the version on the left that you can see is from the 1990 book. Then it evolved into the right-hand picture, which was the 1998 version. And then this is the latest version that appears in the book. Now, how did these versions emerge? By whoever was involved in the book at the time. So in the 1998 version, it was largely Robert and myself reflecting on that process. This version here was the culmination of conversations, I think I'd say, and discussions initially between myself, Robert, John Walcroft, and Jim Bryant, who I'm pleased to see are here joining us today. But then we also did a bit of a tour with this process and presented it to various groups. We presented it to a group of scenario planners, and we presented it to our strategy colleagues at WBS. And from some feedback with them, it got tweaked. Now, there are some common themes that underpin this strategy process, and these have not changed over time. The first is this notion of management as control, where there is the existence of feedback within a strategy process. The second is the notion of direction-driven organizational change. So, for example, deliberate versus emergent strategy. So knowing where you want to be heading. And the third, which I guess really is our OR background, is this notion of critical strategic development, thinking things through prior to undertaking them. Now, within that strategy process, we identified a number of key activities in terms of reflecting how a strategy process might be supported. And the key areas of these activities are that of direction, creation, rehearsal, choice, and implementation. You can see under here that I've listed specific activities. Now, these activities are drawn from boxes in that process diagram. I think it's worth drawing out and highlighting, that we are OR people, and therefore we look at strategy with quite a particular lens. Our training and our background is about being rational, taking systematic approaches to decision making, not relying on hunch and hope, and therefore coming up with a reasoned statement of options and consequences. And our training is about using methods and models to support the process, often in a multi-methodological approach. So we're bringing multiple methods to bear. The other thing I think that came out in the last incarnation of the process, and again, that's very much bringing to the fore the particular lens as OR people that we would take looking at strategy, is this notion of rehearsing prior to enacting strategy. And if you look at a number of the strategy texts that are out there, they really don't distinguish between this rehearsal and enacting. And yet rehearsal is what OR and analytics is all about. It's about using models, often multiple models. That's why there are 3 yellow boxes here and not just one. Multiple takes and multiple approaches to looking at an idea, looking at a system, and reflecting on that prior to enacting. So that's very much the OR perspective. Actually, that's just a duplication of this slide. So in the first chapter of the book, where we talk through the development of that strategy process, we end with a reflection on how tools can be used to support different activities. And what you can see in this table on the left-hand side is a list of a range of different approaches, and these are not all OR approaches. You know, we don't claim to have the only toolkit for supporting strategy. You know, these form both quantitative, qualitative, and management or strategy based tools. I'm going to use the Stenford sort of generic definition of tools rather than you know, which encompasses methods, frameworks, models. And the point really of this diagram is to show that it's not a one-to-one mapping between tool and activity, as this diagram also illustrates. You know, that some tools, so for example, visioning, yes, it is about setting strategic direction, but other tools such as scenario planning can support multiple aspects of a strategy process. So the current content of the book is as follows. It's organized. The first chapter of each of these books is always about explaining the strategy process and how different tools can support different aspects of the process. And then the rest of the books are a collection of chapters supporting different activities. And what you can see here is that the further 5 parts of our last book were indeed about those different activities within the strategy process. And you can see that there are collections of chapters that typically there's little overlap between the chapters. So, you know, we haven't got, for example, multiple chapters on scenario planning. There is just one chapter on scenario planning. However, scenario planning is only one approach for, we've put under the rehearsing strategy part. So the other chapters in that part of the book are looking at system dynamics and also looking at the issue of organizational complexity. I think I can't see ahead, so I think I'm coming to the end. No, the other points to draw out when we were having a discussion about if you're going to write a chapter for the book, the previous book, what should that chapter look like? So if you like, this was the brief that we gave to authors, most of whom followed it, but not all. So not all of the chapters have this structure, but a number of them do. So the idea of a chapter of the book was that the book was intended both to support our teaching, but also to support research in the area and to support practice in the area. So the idea of the chapter was that it would provide an overview of the field and therefore give an updated review of relevant and current literature. But it would actually talk about the tool, the framework, the method and the model that was being presented within that chapter and give a pragmatic introduction of how that could be used to support strategy development, supported by its application to a case. And as I said, the chapters in the current book do this in different combinations. So some of them do have cases, some of them don't. Some of them just focus on reviewing the literature. So there's a bit of a mix. So at this point, where I'm looking at, I'm early. I probably went much quicker than I'd intended. So I'm going to just hand at this point to Martin and Giles and say, is there anything else, and Robert, that we need to do by way of introduction? Or at this point, should we go off into breakouts?
From my perspective, Giles, do you want to start or shall I go?
I don't mind. I'm happy to say. I mean, for me, I think that was really good. Obviously, if people have got questions about that strategy development process, now might be a good time to ask a few basic ones, perhaps. Because it is. I think it's quite a unique contribution, and it's quite a challenging thing to get your head around. I certainly read the chapter several times before I felt I really had it really nailed down well. So it wouldn't surprise me if other people have that response.
Raise his hand. Oh, yes, go ahead. Oh. Yes, please, go ahead.
Yes, good morning. Thanks so much for this introduction, Francis. Really nice introduction of the book. I wish I had a copy and read it throughout my career in the Home Office. So therefore, my question is about policy-related application. Has the book been widely used in government departments in terms of its contribution, directly or indirectly, to the policy making? And give some example would be good. And what is who is the publisher? I may miss that very trivial point. It might be important, it might not be, but that is my interest. And also in terms of a heads up about the contribution and the new additions and a chapter after this long tail of Omicron pandemic. I think I would expect a chapter about the COVID-19 pandemic, how we tackle that in terms of emerging policy. And of course, the second point is the elephant in the room, which is AI. I thought I did it in my career, but I'm so surprised that we're still talking about it. So no doubt I will expect a chapter about AI contribution to the policies. Sorry, I think I would expand this in a small group discussion. I'll shut up now.
I can answer some of those questions. So, and Robert maybe too can answer some of those questions. I mean, in my memory, which isn't always brilliant, I certainly had conversations with the Food Standards Agency about reviewing their strategy process, and that was a direct result. We did have a training program with the OR Society at one point, which the book featured, and I can remember having conversations with people in the Food Standards Agency. And I think there was somebody else in government, but my memory's not that good. Robert, did we have someone else we were talking to at some point? I don't know if Robert's.
No, we have presentation.
Oh, we can't hear you, Robert, sadly. Keep cutting out. I think there were others.
Can
But that's in government. I mean, not talking about in the private sector is a completely different kettle of fish, where various people over the years, we've had conversations with about using the book. There was one who used it quite extensively, and I just, for the life of me, can't remember who or where they were. So, yeah, I mean, we developed the book largely originally to support a module which still runs called OR for Strategic Planning. Has 180 odd students, undergraduate finalists each year, going through it and using the book.
Can I also
You come in.
answer how that's a very good point, how that you raise about supporting a strategy in public policy domain, and clearly that's a very, very interesting area, and I don't see that we cover that. I don't see that covered on the first version, and I think that definitely could be a very, very interesting chapter that you, with a group of colleagues, perhaps in the government, can write about it, because clearly in the government you have many sort of groups that they've been discussing how to support the process. And they come out with a set of sort of books, right? You have the green book, the magenta book, other sort of methods that are discussed in government to support policy making. But I think it could be very, very interesting to have a contribution like that. And regarding the other two topics, definitely I think it's supporting a strategic development in time of crisis, like a global pandemic, or or other sort of issues. I think that could also be a very interesting chapter to develop. Definitely, that's at that time we didn't have this sort of experience, so it would be good to reflect on that. And finally, AI. Yes, it has an implication. It will have an impact. It's still early days, but if there is a chapter on that area, definitely it could be very good, because there are a lot of discussions about if how you treat AI and the trust on AI, and if you keep the humans in the loop or not, and clearly strategy is one of these areas where the problems are not clearly defined, so it could be interesting to discuss that area. So thank you for the contribution. I think it would be great to have contributions in those areas. Yeah, I think Charles had his hand raised, but now he put it.
I was just going to say very quickly, Martin, that I'm involved in a group of people within the government OR service that are exploring the role of operational research in government and in policy making. And yeah, so we certainly will be exploring the link of this, these ideas around strategy within that and to policy making. So that might be, yeah, there's definitely an opportunity for a chapter there, I think, perhaps.
So I think if there's no more question, before we go to the breakout rooms, I would like to share. Yes, that's the idea of the breakout rooms, to have a more reduced group of people talking about yourself and your area of interest. If you haven't read the book, don't worry. It's just to check if you have knowledge about that. But because at this moment we are a bit open to either do a revision of the book or do a completely new book. So, and the most interesting thing at this point is based on your what you like or what you are interested in and your area of expertise, to have a sense of if you want to contribute to the new book and how.
Martin, might I ask a question, please?
Yeah, sure. If you don't raise your hand, I cannot. Yeah, go ahead.
And that is whether the groups might also discuss gaps apparent in the earlier book, and perhaps other people who might be invited in to contribute, because, okay, there's a variety of people present today, but I think there were certainly, to my mind, when we did the previous book, people who it would have been good to have had involved in that. And I'm thinking, for instance, of the oval mapping and, the all Colin Eden stuff, that was represented in a sort of second-hand version through people like myself. But it would have been even better had we had people like that involved in it. And there may be other gaps that people have noticed. So anything like that would be, I think, quite helpful.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. That's definitely is a possibility. And if you enroll to the definitely we will have a feedback in the plenary after these breakout rooms, but there is also Karen sent a link to a sort of a formal Microsoft Office template where you can write what you are going to contribute, and that will be a sort of the base for our sort of contacting people later on after this session. Okay, so if there's no more other questions, I will create the breakout rooms. So it will be randomly assigned, so there's no there's no predefined group. So let's see how Zoom allocates us. I will start now. We will have 6 participants per room. Open on rooms. So you have to join the rooms. I will, Francis and Giles, I will move to a different rooms.
So this part is all about, well, initially it's to hear from the 3 breakout groups, just to have a summary of the discussion that took place, because we were gone for quite some time, an hour, and there were at least 6 or 7 people in each of the rooms. So I'm happy to kick that off, if that's all right. So we had 7, sometimes 8 people in our group, a mixture of practitioners, academics, students, and retired folks too, a real mix of people. And in terms of contributions, we had, for example, Bob Berry, who'd contributed to all 3 books, and was still happy to chip in with the finance angle. We had Eleanor, who used to work for Severn Trent, and had done some scenario work there and had experience of teaching and was happy to contribute. Max from Sheffield, with experience in performance measurement, particularly within the public sector, with his public sector scorecard. Megan from, I don't know where you currently are, Megan. I know you were at Strathclyde, but I didn't catch where you currently are. But I know you're currently involved with data science, but your expertise area is really scenario planning with that behavioural science angle. We had Robert Dyson, of course, and Anthony Bastiani from central government, who said he was an interested party, but actually had some really helpful comments. So I think we've persuaded him to stay around for the moment and hopefully, join in contributing with others. So we each introduced ourselves and talked about areas of expertise, and the areas of expertise did map onto existing chapters, but perhaps with new insight, I'd say. For example, the scenario planning, bringing the behavioural science angle. Bob talked about finance and taking that critical perspective, and issues of emerged of data quality, feeding data. Very rarely in the use of some of these tools, particularly in finance, is the notion of critically reflecting on the data that's gone into them come to the fore. And that was also picked up with Megan in terms of the scenario planning. So I think there are some issues that cut across different tools, and that issue was picked up as well in later discussions. So for example, Max talked about sometimes people don't know what tools to use, and maybe they need help in understanding what tools are relevant and can support different parts of the process. Eleanor talked about complementarity between techniques, and that actually having some guidance within the book on how to use these tools when it's appropriate, and some process related issues about data quality, about people, who do you involve and when, not only in the process, but also in terms of communicating results at the end of the process. So there's that whole business of people. Let me just see if I missed anything else. We also talked about validation and verification issues and related that into the process side of things too. So I think that's a sort of a whistle-stop tour of what went on in our group. I've written notes, so I have got more detail than that, but I think that gives an overview of roughly what went on in our group. Let's hand over to, who wants to go next, Martin or Giles?
I can see Giles.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so that was very interesting. We had a strong public sector influence. So Ian, Vish, Benjamin, and Ho were all public sector backgrounds. So we talked a little bit about the role of strategy and the strategy, the way that strategy and policy happens within a public sector context, and we all sort of agreed that it was incredibly difficult to summarize that context, that it's a very, very difficult context to appreciate. I've been trying for decades to really feel like I understand how that works, and I still find it very challenging. So that was really interesting. I think I mean, certainly from my point of view, it would be great if we could make a real contribution into that space, because obviously, especially these days, government policy is really, really highly impactful in lots of different ways. We also were fortunate to have John Moorcroft in the group as well, and John was able to talk about how the original, well, the last version of the book was put together, and I think that's really, really interesting. That those discussions went on for several years, and led to the development of the process model. I think that's hugely valuable, and I think that it will be, we certainly don't want to lose all of that discussion and insight around thinking about how the various sort of families of analytical work come together in a strategy model. And I'm certainly really, really keen to sort of get involved in that type of discussion going forwards. So just looking at my notes, I think what was very interesting around that discussion of how did that process happen was that there was this process model created by Robert and colleagues, and that process model was developed and added to, and I think that's a great process, and like I said, I think he'd like to see that continue, but certainly not lost. And then the comment was that what we definitely need to do is obviously bring the book up to date in terms of things that have been happening in the world. So obviously a huge interest in analytics and artificial intelligence and obviously data science and things like that, and obviously hugely relevant to the OR discipline, and try and understand how things like that, but also things that have been happening in the world, influence how we might think about making strategy. We also discussed a little bit about, obviously we didn't have time really to get into it hugely, but we talked a little bit about how, different people go about making strategy. So we talked about Colin Eden and how he has that very, very sort of intense facilitative approach to making strategy, which is all around strategy as focus, but then much more analytical approaches to strategy, and how they all sort of exist, and that's really fascinating. But certainly for me, it'd be very interesting to try and make sense of all of that. Yeah, we certainly did discuss about. I was certainly very keen to discuss. One of the things that crops up in my research all the time is what happens out there in the world, and what I do in my practice are obviously different, and the overlap between my methods which suit me and methods which suit managers, and how managers might be all different, I find that absolutely fascinating. And so therefore that for me would be a very interesting question around what sort of framework, what format for making strategy actually resonates in the real world, and how that might be different in like public sector, private sector, but also different organizations might have different approaches. Some might be much more facilitative and discursive, others might be much more analytical. And Ian was able to sort of talk a little bit about policy making and the Green Book, and how there are lots of different logics around evaluating policy, and it's super complex, and yeah, I think we would be great if we could unpack those as well. So that's just a little summary of what went on. If anybody who was there wants to add to that, I don't know if we've got time, but that might be useful.
Ho has raised his hand.
Yes, because of the time was limited in our conversation, and that's quite a discussion. Especially, we were so lucky to have a two eminent facilitator and the author of the book in the room. So there is much of dominant voices in the foreground. So we didn't have a time to discuss other voices, in particular the soft systems approach by Professor Peter Checkland from the Lancaster Business School, will be a great area. But and I understand Rees was very interested in that, and so obviously am I interested, and I use it quite a lot within the Home Office internally. And the Green Book, we have used it in anger in the £30 million program evaluation in the Thatcher years of safer cities. So that's a lot that I can talk about. So obviously, I would respond to the email and put it in writing in more extended space rather than in a limited space of discussion. So that is my reminder that I need to respond to the email. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I will report my group. So I was with Mike Yearwood, Mary Conlon, Jane Christie, Alberto Paucar Cáceres, Jim Bryant, and Francis Sandem. It has been a very interesting discussion, and thankfully Jim was there as well to reflect on the experience with the latest version of the book. Clearly, we have topics that definitely are quite similar to the ones that they've been discussed so far. But let me give you a little bit more information. Mike was mentioning his experience at implementing mobility in cities using a variation of SSM, and clearly I think it's a type of problem, a strategic problem that we haven't seen addressed in the previous book, which is the sort of the large scale type of strategic decisions. And I think there is an interesting angle there to learn more about what are the sort of the challenges of a strategic problem, depending on the definition of or the type of the problem. And that could be a good example. Mary was mentioning her experience of 20 years and trying to working with healthcare and quality improvement, and a bit of her question is how to help the adoption of OR, right, by users. And I think that's also something that the previous version didn't cover much, is that how do we make the non-OR people accept what we are doing and how we are supporting them and the tools that we are using. Definitely they have a sort of a bias towards simple frameworks, which are usually taught in courses and programs, but not perhaps the deep modeling approaches that we learn in OR. And I think that it can be an important barrier on the use of OR in a strategy. Having said that, we also had an interesting discussion on how we make this approach our colleagues in the strategic management field. Clearly, we have some potential linkages with the strategy process colleagues, but it will be good to have something that maps what we do and what they usually do, and see some commonalities on that or differences, and perhaps inviting a colleague from the strategy process. That could be an interesting angle there. Jane was talking about multi-methodology, and clearly her research is how analysts and consultants select the different methods or the multiple methods when they are in government, when they are going to do a project. But there is an interesting question as well, how to evaluate the success of that choice. And I think that's something that it could be very, very interesting to address in this version of the book. And looking at problems that perhaps are related in government, but they are not large scale, like mobility in cities or healthcare. Healthcare definitely we need something there. It's given the challenges that exist as a grand challenge, right, with the aging society and healthcare in general. Alberto was clearly talking about his perception of how PSM has been used in the previous version. Clearly, there's something there that we can give a sort of more prominent role of PSM, especially the theoretical foundations of PSM and how this align to the problems, to the strategic problems. So Alberto was mentioning how the framework that we have between tools and stages in the process resembles something that he observed in in Minger's paper. Jim was asking before I go to Jim, I will go to Francis first. Francis Aiden, he's a PhD student from Nigeria. He's interested in SSM and strategic management. He was interested on what we call robust analysis, but he said that it could be good if we have pay more attention to the type of uncertainties that strategic problems are addressing, because there is something that currently is coming more and more is deep uncertainty, right? Things that we cannot even figure out what is the uncertainty. So that's I think it could be an interesting challenge to address in the next version. So I will now Jim contribution. Clearly, Jim has made a number of reflections on the process of the previous and what are the challenges that editors we have. And I think that could be good if we then answer on these reflections. We have answers on this reflection from Francis, Giles, and Robert, which somehow is clearly the editors will need to do some hard trade-off, right? Because otherwise we will end up with the handbook or an encyclopedia. So that's an interesting things that we will need to consider in the process. My answers to that was clearly we intend to have a collaborative approach to doing the book, and it's not the sort of the editors that decide ultimately what is the final chapter. Clearly, he mentions the need for more substantial case studies. We have practical cases, applications, but I think it will be good to think more carefully how we create substantial case study, how we have this sort of very in-depth case study. And he was mentioning the last chapter about phishing as one of these examples. That's the other things that he mentioned is this trade-off between methods and applications, so theory and really pure practice. And he brought to the example of a strategic choice approach, which is not based on any theory, but on practice. he suggested the possibility of updating his chapters, conflict analysis, and looking at AI to create models for narrative. That could be an interesting aspect. So this is sort of the summary for my group, unless there's somebody else who wants to add something that I miss.
Martin, thank you. Could I just emphasize something? And that was the point that Alberto made around the 4As of soft OR and PSMs, that, generally speaking, people working in that community are used to working across rehearsal and enacting strategy if they're working in that sort of context. And unlike, I think, the chart that Francis presented at the beginning of the presentation, I think, there's a lot of breadth there. And that is something that is uniquely a contribution from the soft OR PSM community, I think, that could be, sort of brought to the fore or emphasized, or rather than in the current organization of the book, kind of pigeonholed in a particular kind of phase. So these are more sort of cross-cutting things that, and particularly case studies that emphasize the fact that they've worked all the way through from, sort of appreciating to action.
Yeah. So I think we have the report from all the groups. So what was the next?
Yeah, just to say, I agree with what Mike just said, and also, sorry, I was going to say something else, forgot what it was. That's why I'm not saying so much. I agree with what Mike just said, and also the, maybe the whole idea of people and stakeholders ought to play a greater role in the book than they perhaps did do in the current version.
Yeah, that's good. So Francis, what is in the next in our agenda? I forgot. Ian.
Next steps.
Next step. Ian has raised his hand.
Yes, thank you. No, I was just triggered by Robert's remark about the roles, because the Aqua book can actually be quite helpful in that, where it establishes very clearly there's a commissioner of analysis, and I'd include any of the work we talked about this morning in that. They're often not analysts. They just appreciate that those boxy things with the arrows and words on them can be quite useful, and that has been the extent of one of the briefs. I thought I'd go and do one of those workshops with boxes and arrows and words and stuff. And I thought, so they want a systems diagram then. And so commissioner, the lead analyst, the practitioner, an assuring analyst who reviews what they've done, an assurer who says, yes, this is a proper use of whatever it is you're doing, but it's not actually the commissioner of the work. And actually having those roles, it's something we do teach as part of the multi-criteria college, short session introducing MCDA, I do, and it's certainly central to the quality assurance side of things. But actually that framework is quite useful because it brings out this point that the analysis is being done for someone. So who the commissioner is often a good question. Thanks.
The screen, Francis, for the slides, or we go straight? Yeah. Okay. Good. I would say the first part, seeking proposal for contribution. I think it's the discussions in the breakout rooms have been very, very useful in that sense. I hope more or less everybody has an initial idea of what we are doing. It would be very useful if you can fill this Microsoft form, so we have a sort of an additional source for our notes, and see. And we have your contact detail as well in that form, so we can come back to that. Francis, I think the next 2 points, well, before we go to the next 2 points, is connecting proposals with the for contribution with the proposal for a publisher. We are trying to address or to reach Wiley again for the publication of the book. So definitely we will try to do that. If that fails, we will go. We will look for another very good publisher, perhaps Taylor, Francis, I don't know, Palgrave, somebody who has some publisher who has a good portfolio of publications in strategy and OR as well, either together or in a separate forms. But definitely for a proposal for the publisher, we will need a sort of a small description of each chapter. So it will help us to have that you fill that form for us to create that proposal for the publisher on your contribution. Then the 2 middle points, I think Francis may want to say something, or Robert, about the sort of the process of the creation of the book.
Yeah. Last time we, I think we sought contributions, and some contributions just came in. You know, we said the sort of structure of things that we were looking for, and people wrote chapters and sent them in. Other contributions arose through a process of sharing and reflection, I think I'd like to call it. In particular, I mean, chapter 14 came about by myself, Maureen Meadows, with our scenario hats on, John Moorcroft with his system dynamics hat on, and Jim Bryant with his drama theory hat on, sharing our methods to each other because we weren't all familiar with each other's methods, and having a sort of a reflective session and discussion to try to understand each other's methods and think about complementarity. And that's really how the chapter 14 came about, because we designed an approach and tried it out on students, which is what chapter 14 reports. So I suppose I want to put it out there that we're not expecting at this stage that you know exactly what your chapter might look like, but rather if you have expertise in an area, then one way forward would be that we conduct a series potentially of further research meetings where people can present potential ideas or topic areas, and we have some reflection on that. I mean, I know, for example, in our group, there was one person, Anthony, I think, who would be willing to join those sorts of reflections and potentially contribute rather than necessarily having an off-the-shelf tool that he would want to write about. And I suspect that there may well be others in the group in a similar position. So the second point was we do have an opportunity to present ideas, to present things at OR 64. Martin is organising the OR and strategy stream there, and I imagine we'll be shortly issuing a call for papers. That conference is a face-to-face conference. It's not a virtual conference like over the past 2 years. So if people do want to contribute some stuff, that would be another opportunity to present ideas for what they might contribute. How does that sound? John?
Just a quick point that one of the things that I find quite frustrating over the years is that I've had many conversations with very experienced people in the public sector and also in the private sector who've got huge amounts of experience of doing strategy and doing OR, but that experience and that knowledge gets lost because it's never published. So it might be that there are people who are here today that have a lot of experience of practice, but they don't have the time or the inclination to write about it. In which case, there might be some nice collaborations between practitioners and academics who, you know, together they can make something really useful.
We have a question about what sort of timetable do we have in mind for the book?
Very good question. And I don't know is the answer to that. I'm just trying to think realistically what happened last time. I think it was a process that took a couple of years, I'm going to say. And Robert will correct me, or anyone else who was involved will correct me if I'm wrong. And that couple of years is, sort of start to finish rather than, so if we looked at now as the absolute start, then I would imagine a couple of years to publication rather than starting contribution. Does that sound about right? I think it took a couple of years. When I think about the number of, the research meetings we had and the tours we did.
Yeah, Francis, I think that's realistic because there'll be quite a lot of not only responding to people's ideas, but also perhaps seeking out, as Jim mentioned earlier on, I think, perhaps seeking out particular people to contribute. And certainly I agree with Giles that if we could get some practitioner input by them working alongside academics, that would be very valuable.
Yes, definitely. I think a couple of years that will be a realistic timetable. Clearly, we may have some of your ideas. We need to put all together and then set up the next meeting. And yeah, I think, but it's realistically perhaps to think on a process where we meet or we meet to discuss what has been the developments every 3 months could be something to have in mind.
Good. I'm conscious of time. We're nearly at 1:30. So let me just quickly wrap up. I think what will happen next is the four of us will get together and ponder on what's happened today, with a view to if I'm hearing Martin correctly, with a view to organising another meeting to sort of share progress and obviously there'll be some structure to it that will emerge once we've had our reflections. We will, most of us, I think, or all of us will be attending, the four of us will be attending OR 64. So that will be one opportunity to have a face-to-face meeting with people. But I imagine that the next meeting, if it is before OR 64, may well be another virtual meeting. And I think when we talked initially, we did talk of mixing virtual meetings and face-to-face meetings going forward.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, realistically, I'm just thinking aloud now, and I haven't talked to anyone else. Timescales wise, I guess OR 64 will be the next opportunity.
Yeah.
So we'll maybe put some of our thoughts in a call for papers, and invite people maybe to come and present some potential ideas there.
Yeah, that's a good plan.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. You have the last word, Martin.
No, just thank you. Thank you, Francis, for putting the slides together, and thank you for, yes, everybody for coming to very interesting discussion that, yeah, I think somehow we miss it, I could say, from our perspective. We have a good chat about strategy and OR.
Okay, so without further ado, I think let's call the meeting to a close. If you want to switch your cameras on and wave goodbye, then we get to see everybody. And just to remind you, Martin had put that link in. If you haven't already completed that little survey, that would be really helpful to us.
Yes.
And thanks very much. And hopefully you'll be hearing from us shortly.
Yeah.
And thanks also to Karen from the OR Society for setting up the technology.
Exactly. That's right. So if you want to stop sharing the screen so we can have all the faces.
Sorry, there we go.
There we go.
Right.
Okay. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Thanks, everybody.
you.
Cheerio now. Bye-bye.
See you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.